We ended our last video saying that we were going to engage some of the specifics of the world behind the text, and specifically the world behind the text with respect to John in our case. Before we move to those specifics, I want to give you some information or some categories for thinking about the world behind the Gospel of John. So remember that last video, I sort of divided out the ways of engaging the world behind the text between the world behind the text as a whole, thinking about the author of John, the purpose of John, the date of John, the audience of John as a whole, and then those questions that we might ask about a specific passage or calling attention to the socio-political, the historical, and the cultural elements that show up in a particular passage. And so at the end of this video, we're going to get some practice looking at and identifying questions we might want to ask about a particular passage from John. But before we do that, I want to give you some of the major categories of the world behind the Gospel of John. With respect to each one of these, I'm going to sort of lay out for you the different options that you're going to find in your readings for authorship, for dating, for purpose and audience, and not necessarily make a specific argument about any one of these. And you'll often find that in your readings, the authors do not necessarily make a specific argument about any one of these, but sort of lay out the options for you about these different elements with respect to the world behind John. So we're going to go ahead and start here with our authorship. And we have a named author in the Gospel of John, or I should say we have a named figure in the Gospel of John, who is its author, namely the beloved disciple, who shows up several different times in the Gospel, but at the end of the Gospel of John is explicitly named as the one who wrote these things down, who wrote the things that are in the Gospel down. So our named figure as the author of the Gospel of John is the beloved disciple, but then the question is, who is the beloved disciple? Who is the historical figure that this beloved disciple figure in the gospel refers to? And there's a couple different options that I've divided into our primary options and our secondary options. I say primary options insofar as these are sort of the more of the majority opinion, or have been at different points in the history of Johannine scholarship, have been the majority opinion on the authorship of John. And the secondary options are a little bit more fringe, maybe a little bit more fun. But so our primary options are going to be John, the son of Zebedee. And so this is going to be the traditional author of the Gospel of John, dating back to the 2nd century. So from the 2nd century onwards, John, son of Zebedee, who figures prominently in the Synoptic Gospels, but is not named in the 4th Gospel. So the sons of Zebedee are named, but not John specifically. Shows up in the Synoptic Gospels and has, from the early church tradition onward, has been sort of identified as the beloved disciple and as the author of the Gospel of John. And this is presumably where we get the name the Gospel of John from. And so this title, the Gospel of John, does not occur in would not have occurred in sort of the earliest versions of the text, and is a later title added in probably the 3rd century or so. It's also possible that the John mentioned in this title later on is referring to John the Elder. So a different John figure who is not John the son of Zebedee, is not one of Jesus's disciples, but is a different person named John who was active in Ephesus in the 1st century and was a part of the Jesus movement. And then the third option here is the Johannine community. This is to take more of sort of an anonymous approach to the beloved disciple, and to say that the beloved disciple is not named for a particular reason, because the beloved disciple could refer to sort of anyone within this group. Anyone within John is one of Jesus's, anyone within the Johannine community is one of Jesus's beloved, and sort of it's a stand-in character in which the reader can put themselves into the narrative in a way. And the Johannine community also sort of takes that stage approach, the diachronic approach, to the composition of the Gospel of John, and saying that there are different stages, that there are different parts of the Gospel that were written at different times by different members of this community. are secondary options, and I'm not going to go into sort of the reasoning why any one of these figures might be identified as the author, but there are scholars who have defended each one of these options for different reasons. And I said they're secondary options because they're sort of typically more one-off options. That is to say, not a large contingency of scholarship has thought of one or more of these as the author, but each one has been defended. If any of them has been defended more than once, and if any of them might be moved over into that primary options category, it would probably be Lazarus. And if you go back and watch the New Testament intro video on the Gospel of John, who wrote it and why, which I will link at the end of this video, you can, there I lay out a little bit more of the case of why someone might think Lazarus wrote it. Some of the other options here, we have Doubting Thomas or Thomas Didymus, Mary Magdalene, and the Samaritan woman. Moving down to our date for the Gospel of John, we are in pretty firm territory, suggesting that the Gospel of John was written before 130 CE. So this is what is called the terminus postquem. The latest date which the Gospel would be written is about 130. And the reason for that is this fragment from the Gospel of John, which is typically dated to sometime around 125 or 130. And this would not have been an original a fragment of the original or first pen Gospel of John. So we're assuming some time for copies of the Gospel of John to have been made. So this fragment, which is usually dated to about 130, makes it clear to us that the Gospel could not have been written after this fragment was created. And generally speaking, our terminus antiquem, or the date before which, the date after which the gospel must have been written, would be 70 CE in the destruction of the temple. And this is normally thought to be the date after which the gospel must be written, because Jesus seems to refer to the destruction of the temple in John chapter 2 when he talks about, when he makes the sort of prediction about the temple's destruction. He says, destroy this temple, talking about his body. He seems to be alluding to what had already happened in the past with the destruction of the temple. So it's sort of in the Gospel of John itself, it seems to be that the destruction of the temple is already assumed. And the standard view is going to sort of narrow these down a little bit to about a decade or so, between 90 CE and 100 CE. And the reasons for this, sort of very broadly stated, are the first of which, this gets us sort of the pushes us a little bit later than 70 CE, is going to be the sort of parting of the ways between Jews and Christians. What we find in the Gospel of John is that there seems to be Jews and Christians are starting to identify with respect to one another, or sort of in opposition to one another, or at least the Gospel of John identifies its followers or its community in opposition to Jews. So it seems to be that Christians have had some sort of time to ideologically distinguish themselves from Jews and are maybe not considered Jews anymore. And so this would push us probably further away from 70 CE, when Christians were probably still sort of considered within the fold of Judaism in a way. So the later you go on, the further these ways part from one another. And John seems to imply a further parting of the ways than many other New Testament texts do. And then the other reason that we sort of get a little bit later is that we need some time for the Gospel of John to circulate. So this circulation presumes that the Gospel had sort of been around for a little bit and had gotten out there to other people and to other communities. With respect to the purpose of the Gospel of John, just like with the authorship of the Gospel of John, we get a statement about its purpose, but also like the statement about the author of the Gospel of John, it's a little bit enigmatic, or it's a little bit puzzling. So I give us two different translations of John 20:31 here, and I want you to go ahead and we'll do just a very minor lecture pause. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can spot the difference between these two translations. Good. So the difference here is so that you may come to believe versus so that you may continue to believe. So John 20:31 has this statement about why these things were written, why the Gospel of John was written, and it has something to do with belief. But there's a sort of a textual question here about the form of this verb in Greek, whether it implies a starting belief or whether it implies a belief that's already there that is continued or sort of persevered in. So we can think of this purpose statement as perhaps having might go one of two different ways. It could be evangelistic, that is to say, these things are written to bring in new believers, to get people to start but to believe, or it might be written to encourage people who already do believe in the midst of some kind of crisis. And what the nature of that crisis is could be a number of different things, but it seems to be somehow related to this out of the synagogue language and the rift between Jews and the Johannine community when the text was written. Another option, sort of for our purpose, so the evangelistic and the encouragement are directly related to John 20:31. But another option would be, especially if the Gospel of John is written later than the Synoptics by maybe a few decades. If it knows the Synoptic Gospels, which is an open question and one you might engage in this class, the Gospel of John might be written as another account either to supplement or to supplant or replace the Synoptic Gospels. So perhaps John's purpose is to sort of give us more about Jesus and Jesus's life, or perhaps it's to give us the right version of Jesus and Jesus's life. And our last aspect of the world behind the Gospel of John as a whole is our audience. For whom was the Gospel of John written? And this also sort of relates back to that purpose statement. If the Gospel's purpose is somewhat evangelistic, that it's sort of reaching out to bring new believers in, then the Gospel might be written with an audience of interested outsiders in mind. That is, people who are interested in this Jesus character, are interested in the Jesus movement or Christianity or Judaism, and this document is sort of then written as a tool by which new believers might be brought in. If the gospel's purpose is to promote continued belief, then the audience might be something like intimidated insiders. If the insiders are intimidated by their relationship with Judaism, if they're intimidated by circumstances that might be happening within their Jewish community and being kicked out of the synagogue, then perhaps John is written to those who are already within this movement and are facing some kind of crisis within their community, and perhaps their community in Ephesus, which is sort of the traditional location for the Gospel of John and the Johannine literature. Or it might be that it's that the author doesn't necessarily have outsiders or insiders in mind, but is really writing sort of in a general kind of way. We don't always, when we write things, have specific audiences in mind. Books aren't always written with particular peoples or groups in mind. So the Gospel of John might be written for a more general readership that contained persons who were already Christians or persons who were not yet Christians. And this is sort of precisely the argument of this collection, the Gospels for all Christians, really for all four of the canonical Gospels, for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The essays in this volume make the claim that all of these Gospels don't necessarily have particular communities in mind, that the Johannine community isn't necessarily a thing, but rather the Gospel is written for anyone who might be interested in reading about Jesus and his signs. And then lastly, to sort of piggyback on that relationship with the synoptics that you might engage in this class at some point, the Gospel of John could be written for readers of the synoptics. So if the Gospel of John is trying to supplant or supplement the synoptics, then it's sort of version 2.0 or a different version of the story for persons who are already familiar with the story, but the Gospel of John is going to sort of give those readers new things, new information, and new data. All right, so let's shift gears here back to the world behind the specifics of the text. So with respect to the world of the text, we have it divided behind the world of the text as a whole, which we just laid out some of those categories with respect to John at the beginning of this video. And we also have this other category of the world behind the specifics of the text, what Michael J. Gorman in his book calls detailed analysis. And so I wanted to just start practicing a little bit of detailed analysis here with a lecture pause. And this is the kind of thing, or the kind of way you might get started doing historical, cultural, and socio-political analysis of your particular passage. So what I want you to do is pause the video here, go ahead and read the account of the wedding of at Cana of Galilee, Jesus' first sign in the gospel. And what I want you to do is identify as many historical, social, and cultural features of the text that you can. So anything in here that seems to have a historical referent, a social referent, or a cultural referent, and knowing more about would sort of maybe help you be a better reader of this passage or help you understand the passage a little bit more. So just make a bullet point list of all the words or phrases that have historical, social, or cultural aspect to them. And when you unpause, I will come and give you some of the ones that I came up with. All right, so I have grouped these together a little bit. So I noticed the idea of the setting of a wedding. So here we not only have a feature of the world of the text insofar as we are engaging the literary setting or the narrative setting where the account takes place, but knowing something about the nature of weddings in John's context in the ancient world might help us sort of better imagine what is happening in this passage, to know about, who is at weddings, what takes place at weddings, these kinds of things is going to help us better understand what's going on here and what we are to imagine or how we are to sort of visualize the narrative taking place in front of our eyes. So specifically, I also highlighted invited and bridegroom. So who gets invited to weddings? How do they get invited to weddings? Why do they get invited to weddings? Is the culture of weddings similar to our culture of weddings, where sort of anyone connected to the bride and groom comes together and they may not know each other, or is it more a familial affair? All of these questions are the things that we might want to know more about weddings so we can think about what this particular wedding might have been like. And then I also highlighted bridegroom because we might think about what grooms were like, and how they prepared for weddings, what their role was at the wedding. Here it seems that the bridegroom has some kind of role and some kind of relationship to the stewards or slaves who are doing the work of the wedding. So knowing things about these particularities of weddings might help us understand the passage as well. Cana of Galilee, our physical location. This is a place where we might look to a biblical atlas to know where Cana is, where it's situated in the Galilee, where it's situated with respect to Judea and Jerusalem. And then there are several references to wine here. So this is in a way a literary observation. We have three uses of the term wine and one use of the word drunk. So what is the culture? What's the cultural values and expectations around alcohol, and particularly around wine, and how one consumes it and the amounts one consumes. Knowing more about these things, knowing more about what people thought about wine, how they experienced wine, might help us make sense of what's going on with respect of turning water into wine in the passage. And then lastly, I have highlighted here the 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification. Knowing some things about Jewish rites of purification might tell us might have some sort of implicit commentary about what the author of John thinks about rites of purification, why those water jars were there, how they might have been used, whether the guest had already used them in preparation for the wedding. So there we have sort of a crossover between one feature of one historical cultural feature of the text and another one. So these are the things that I've highlighted. You probably got more out there than I did. And to get more information about these, we might go to these different resources that I called attention to in the last video. So general tools, if we looked in a study Bible, we could find perhaps notes about some of these specific things that, that I've called attention to. And if we did not find a note there, our next place to probably go would be to go to a multi-volume commentary and see if what is not in the study Bible is in the multi-volume commentary. Or if something is in the study Bible, might we get more information in the multi-volume commentary? A study Bible might also contain a map that shows us where Cana of Galilee is. If it did not, an atlas certainly would. We might find some information about these things in our textbooks. If the textbook has a particular section in John on this passage. And the same thing with the single volume commentaries. We would likely find some information in a single volume commentary about this passage, but it wouldn't likely be all that extensive. We probably would find a reference to wine in a single volume dictionary, but a multi-volume dictionary is going to give us a whole lot more information about wine. The same would be true with purification and weddings. Purification would likely show up in a single volume dictionary. We'd get more information in a multi-volume dictionary. And something like wedding may not show up. Marriage probably would show up in a single volume dictionary. But again, we're going to get more information in our specialized tools. So these are the places, the sort of next steps in the process. So if you found something in this passage, or if you have looked forward to your own passage, we're going to talk more about these general and specialized tools and sort of introduce them and get practice using them as the semester progresses. But if you are interested in any of these particular ideas, concepts, or words that you've called attention to, or if there's any in your particular passage that you are working on for the semester, this is your next stop, your next place to go to be able to get more information about the world behind your particular text.